I'd like to give everybody a warm welcome and welcome Scott Young. Scott Young is a Canadian who did an extraordinary thing. He went around the world, if I understand this correctly, and didn't use English in his travels, which is an amazing thing to think about. As we are language speakers and living in places where the temptation to use English or the fall into the use of English is so great. So I'm Edward Graham, this is Fluent Abroad, and we're here to help people learn street speaking skills for local languages. And today we have with us Scott Young. So Scott, welcome.
Great to be here. Great to chat with you about this.
Yeah. So let's jump right into it. I'm so curious, what got you, let's go to before you actually did this. What actually made you decide and commit to the idea of traveling around the world and not using English?
Well, I actually had a language learning experience before I did this project. Part of the reason I had a little bit of confidence going into it because I kind of knew what learning a language would be all about. But the learning the language process wasn't, it was successful, I think, if you compare it to a lot of people who don't learn a language when they go to a country, but it didn't feel as successful as I'd like it to be. And what happened is I was studying abroad in France for a year, and I really wanted to learn French from the get-go. I wanted to do that. That was something I always thought would be so cool. You know, you go to a country and you come back and people are like, ooh, you can speak this language. I just thought that would be a nice treat. And
it's always a Canadian thing, right? It's like you always feel guilty about not knowing French if you don't.
Right. You want to know French. It'll be a useful language. It'll be a good investment. And then I can feel like, yeah, this is something I have to learn. So I was really interested in learning French. And what happened was, first of all, I get there. I don't speak French. I haven't done French immersion, or I did a few French classes very poorly taught in an entirely Anglophone small town. So you can consider myself essentially having zero French other than maybe a few words off of the Duolingo packaging that we have here in Canada. And I land in France, and suddenly I'm presented with all these decisions that are kind of overwhelming. So one of the decisions was an academic one. Do I want to study in French or in English? Yeah. Now, in retrospect, I should have said I'll study in French, but the way that they were working is that our grades were getting transferred back home, and I was a little worried, well, if I'm going to fail these classes, it's going to set me back a year. I don't want to, I don't want to risk the idea that, well, I've never learned French before, and doing university classes in another language may just be too difficult. Now, once I made that decision, I did try to change it kind of middle of the year, and they said, nope, you're already in this system, you're stuck. So that was one decision.
English-speaking bubble, right?
I am now in the English-speaking bubble. And then the second problem was that there were tons and tons of people, so this was a subtler decision. The decision of which language to study in kind of had obvious ramifications. I knew that when I picked English, it would be harder to learn French, but it may prevent me from failing classes. But the other decision, which I didn't really anticipate, was how the social circle was forming kind of organically. And just by speaking English, I would form better friends with people who also were speaking English. And they would get used to me speaking English, even if they also spoke French. And this continued to compound itself. So I would meet other English-speaking people through those English-speaking people, and it would continue to exacerbate the situation. And I was very frustrated because after a few months, I realized everyone speaks to me in English. Even people who speak French speak to me in English. And if I try to speak in French, it's very weird. People are used to hearing me in English. They speak in English to me. Some people would even get kind of, like, your French isn't very good. Why are you speaking in French? And so I was forced to learn French in the few moments that I could kind of escape out of this circle, or when I was, dealing with shopkeeps and that kind of thing. And I did work hard, and I do feel like I reached an okay level of French, but I just felt like, this situation, I didn't see it forming. I wanted to be in this immersive environment, and I figured I'm going to another country. Obviously, I'll be in an immersive environment, right. And that just did not happen. And it felt very insidious how it just kind of happened organically. Like it wasn't like the decision I made to study in English. It was very much happening without my consent, that it just automatically created this bubble.
Exactly.
And having traveled a lot, I've met so many people that this is exactly what happened to them. And I think for the few of you people here listening to this who have not lived abroad or have not studied abroad, and especially if English is your first language, I find that people who speak English as a second language have an easier time avoiding it because they're maybe not entirely comfortable in English, so they can kind of slide into the other language. But for lots and lots of people I've met, this is exactly what happens. That they go to another country, they're so overwhelmed with the culture shock, with immediately getting there, with all that stuff, that they just slide into speaking English a bit, and they tell themselves, you know what, I'm going to start practicing this language a little bit later. But later comes around, and now they've have this very fixed structure of their life, which doesn't support immersion. So I had that experience, and I had a little bit of misgivings about it. I was like, well, you know, that could have done a little better. I had read people online, like we were just talking earlier, people like Benny Lewis, who really were promoting this, you know, immersive approach, and I felt kind of bad when I was in France that I wasn't doing it. And so a couple of years later, I had the opportunity to go back to France, this time for a month, and I knew some French people there, so I already had a leg in, and I told myself, no, this time I'm going to just tell everyone I'm only speaking in French. Everyone I was meeting just spoke in French, so it was okay. And
how did you do that? Did you tell them, email them before in French or in English and say, this is my last English communication with you. From now on, it's going to be in French?
I don't remember how I contacted them. I think what I did, these people who I was friends with, they were not other exchange students. They were actually French people, and I had been practicing a bit of French with them. So it wasn't,
so you broke the ice.
It wasn't as if it was like, ooh, this person's speaking French and I'm not expecting it. But they did expect it to be more 50-50. So usually I would start speaking to them in French and just let them know that my plan was to only speak in French for that month. And because these people were native French speakers and my French wasn't so abysmal at this point that they struggled to communicate with me, actually everyone was really supportive. They were like, oh yeah, that's what you should be doing. You're in France, you should be speaking French. Like they had that kind of feeling about it. And it was really good. I felt like in that 1 month, my French level went up so fast compared to when I was living there for the full year. And I thought, you know, why hadn't I done this the first time? So fast forward another year or so, and
why didn't you do it before?
As I said, I think
there was a domino effect. You didn't expect it. It wasn't.
It was unexpected. I didn't expect it to happen. And honestly, when you're traveling abroad, especially for the first time, it can be kind of overwhelming, and you're just trying to keep your head above water. You're even without the language. And so you don't realize that, oh, you're making decisions unconsciously right now that are going to affect how quickly you learn this language later and how much practice you get and that kind of thing. So at this point, it was still kind of a theoretical notion, because when I did go back to France to do the no English rule, it worked, but I'd already spent a year learning French. So I was already kind of conversational. So my feeling was I've already had long conversations in French, although, you know, it took me a lot longer to learn it, and it was a lot more work, and it felt like I wasn't as immersive as I'd like to be. But it wasn't really like, I didn't feel at this point like, oh, with minimal practice, you go to a country and just not speak English. So that was sort of when I was talking with, planning out this later trip. So this was the trip that I wrote about on my blog called The Year Without English. And a friend of mine and I, that we decided that we were going to travel to countries, and then later that we were going to learn the languages. And then later we decided, you know, based on this experience, you know, a good way to learn the languages might be to just not speak English. And we did a little bit of practice. We did I think we did about maybe 50 hours of Spanish and, maybe 30 hours of Korean, and like around that amount of practice. So definitely not enough to be fluent by any means, but enough to know some basic phrases so that you actually know how to say, like, hola, ¿cómo estás?
Exactly. So let me just make sure that I understand. So
sure.
You were preparing yourself to speak the local languages that were your target. You weren't doing a project where you were going around the world, for example, knowing you weren't going to be able to communicate in many of the local languages, but refusing to speak in English just to see what kind of experience you would have. That wasn't your objective.
No. Our objective was very much, we're going there to, like, when we go, the first country was Spain. It was, we want to learn Spanish, and we want to see how far we can get in 3 months. And the idea was the mechanism to enforce immersion is going to be, we're not going to speak English. We're not going to speak English to each other. We're not going to speak English to anyone we met, whether they're Spanish or not. If we go to a party and someone doesn't speak Spanish, we're just going to like maybe avoid that person. We were very, very extreme about it. The only exceptions were like emergencies and calls home, because my parents don't speak Spanish and they don't want to just avoid contact with me for a year. And we also, I have a blog that I write in English, so I was writing in English and doing emails, but my verbal communication was supposed to be as close as possible entirely in Spanish. We weren't sure whether this would work when we did this. We honestly weren't sure. It wasn't like we were, we had all this experience and we knew that this would work. I thought that it would allow us to learn faster, but 3 months is not a lot of time to learn a new language. I think, as most people can agree. I think most people I've spoken to who have fluency in a language have usually studied it for a couple years at least. Now, maybe they're not doing as intense immersion in one burst, but I've met very few people that go from 0 to, oh, this person is actually functional in this language in 3 months. So we didn't have a lot of evidence of that. And
by functional, do you mean more than transactional? So you would concede that in 3 months a person doing what you did could definitely get around shops, transportation, small talk, or do you think not even at that level? Let me get to that, because we didn't know what level we'd reach. We thought, well, maybe we'll just be able to transact in we could go to. I figured we'd be able to go to a shop and order at a restaurant. That's usually pretty easy to learn, but I didn't know whether we'd be able to make friends speaking this language, or have relationships with people, or go to parties, or I didn't know what would happen exactly. So we went there. Side was the big question then. Yeah.
Well, would we be able to live our lives kind of like we do in Canada, or would it be a severe handicap the whole time? That was the open question. And also the question of whether it would be just too difficult to maintain it. So we weren't sure about this, but the amazing thing is that particularly with Spain, it was not only were we able to maintain this no English rule fairly fanatically, I would say. There were very, very few exceptions when we didn't speak in English. There wasn't, we would speak to everyone in Spanish, but also, and I think anyone who's listening to this right now who wants some evidence of this, we have a documentary that shows our week-by-week progress with Spanish. I am of the belief that our Spanish got to a fairly good level in 3 months, and enough that, I was dating a Spanish girl. We were going to parties where we had all our friends were in Spanish. We had good friends. We were able to do everything. Now, this doesn't mean that we were perfectly fluent. If I'm watching a Spanish movie, I still don't understand things. And, reading a novel might be kind of hard. But just in terms of our ability to live the life and enjoy ourselves and not feel awkward, not feel like a lot of strain and pressure because we're speaking this foreign language, that actually evaporated really quickly, and we were able to get into it. So this was the first country of our planned trip, and because it went so well, I think it really set the stage for us trying it in the other countries. Now,
just to be clear, you already had the experience of French before you did the Spanish, right?
That is true. Which
is a great advantage, right, for any Latin language.
The Romance language definitely helps with acquiring, knowing French definitely helps with Spanish.
Did your friend have the same background?
But that's the point I was going to say, is that he did not. Now, he is from India, so he did know another language. His native language is Hindi, and he knows English.
So it wasn't the case of two monolingual English speakers trying this. It was the case of two people with some experience at learning languages and some exposure to similar language.
True. I wouldn't now.
Not to undercut what you're doing. I think what you're doing is fascinating, but I want to make sure that we're clear about where you were starting.
I think, well, for my case, I've explained my story, and I think it's fairly clear where I'm coming from to other people. But my travel partner's case, he's sort of interesting because on the one hand, he is completely bilingual in Hindi and English. So in some ways, he has more language learning experience than I do because, I'm not bilingual in French. I'm okay in French, but I'm not the same as a French person. Whereas he is, I would say, the same as an English-speaking person in English.
I would qualify what you're saying, but let's keep going.
However, what I was going to say is that he learned English since he was a child. So it's also kind of like it's also a first language. So he never went to a country when he was, when he came to Canada, he already was fluent in English. Correct. And he just got better. It was not that. So I think, there was a lot about the mechanisms of learning a foreign language as an adult that he did not have as well honed as I did. But I think, and I'm encouraging people to seek out the little documentary we made in Spanish. We even made recordings of our day-by-day experience. It became kind of tedious towards the end of the trip, so we stopped doing it. But
we'll
you
put the link. We'll put the link in the at the end of the podcast. We'll stick the link into.
Yeah, sure. I'll send you the link because I think it's a little bit long. But if you just Google "The Year Without English Spanish," it usually comes up. And so essentially, the trip in Spain was the most successful, I think, in terms of our later functional ability. We had I would say after about the first month, it was very smooth living in Spanish. We never felt tired for speaking in Spanish all day. And we were able to do, I would say, most of the things that you would want to do if you were to live in a country for 3 months. Make friends, go on dates, see people, like go to parties, interact with everyone, like everything in day-to-day life we were able to do. Mm-hmm. And so, this doesn't mean that it was perfect. I want to give the impression we were completely fluent, but definitely from the psychological perspective of when you start learning a language and it's so much effort, that was essentially gone. The later countries, because we also did the same thing in Brazil for Portuguese, China for Chinese, and Korea for Korean, were also, I think they were also successful, and you can also see the documentaries we made for those. However, they weren't as pure a success as Spain. So for Brazil, for instance, we didn't do any practice in Portuguese before we went there, and we realized actually it's probably good to do about 30 to 50 hours of practice, just so you know the basic phrases, because we did end up having to deal with some crisis situations, and we were using Spanish because we had to transition. And both China and Korea being Asian languages, the 3-month time scale is not long enough, in my opinion, to get to a truly comfortable level like we were in Spanish.
Were you only, just an interruption, were you only focused on speaking, or because obviously the writing in the Asian languages is a lot different?
Right. So I took a different approach. I know some people take the approach that when they're learning Chinese, for instance, that they completely ignore the writing system. Mm-hmm. And I actually didn't do that. I'm not necessarily advocating that as an approach because learning the writing system is more work, and that did not learn the writing system. My travel partner did not attempt to learn any characters, and he was able to similar kind of process of learning the language. I decided that I wanted to make a long-term investment in Chinese, so beyond the 3-month window, and I felt like I wanted to have a good foundation of not only sort of the stuff that was necessary for getting by, but I also wanted to make sure that my tones were accurate. I wanted to make sure that I had a good understanding of the pronunciation, and that I also had some basic understanding of the character system, so that if I want to continue learning, it's not like, okay, I got to start this from scratch. Mm-hmm. So I did decide to learn the character, but it did make for more studying, I think,
sure.
if you're going to do.
And with Korean, the same, right?
And Korean is actually a lot easier. I recommend everyone learn the writing system in Korean simply because it is an alphabet. And the amount of effort it takes to learn, just maybe not become fluent in reading, like you can read the letters really quickly, but just to know what they mean and how to pronounce them is very useful.
Familiar enough, right?
That's going to help you with menus, street signs, everything. And it takes, as I said, to learn the writing system, you could probably cover it once in about an hour, and then probably with about a week or two of on and off practice, you would be able to see signs and then pronounce them correctly. Whereas Chinese isn't like that. Chinese, all the characters are different, so it's a considerable investment to be able to learn and read in Chinese.
That's right. So let me ask you some. Go ahead. Go ahead, and then I have a couple of general questions.
I want to be, while we're being full disclosure, we did the no English rule, I would say, essentially perfectly in Spain. Almost perfectly in Brazil if you exclude, a few crisis situations and the fact that we had a little bit of leftover Spanish in the transition. China, I felt like I did the no English rule fairly well. That struggled with it more. He didn't do very much practice beforehand. And so there were some times where we had to piece time out and debrief. And then Korea, country number 4 was a hard country, so we did have to have some time on breaks. But the essential strategy of being immersion was the same. But I do want to point out that, especially in Korea, but also as the later part of the trip went on, it wasn't as pure as it was in Spanish, where it was like literally no exceptions to the rule.
Do you find, just on that, did you find that it was just the fatigue as part of it, or was it the difficulty of the languages and the lack of familiarity with them that made those choices happen?
So two points on that. One, we underestimated the difference in difficulty between the Asian and European languages. I know that Benny Lewis, for example, what we've talked about, is kind of famous for downplaying the difference. Like, well, some people say French is really hard and it's the same as Chinese. Now, having learned, let's say, Spanish and Chinese side by side, and this is my opinion, take it with a grain of salt, that is not the case. Chinese is much harder in terms of, I would say, to reach a similar level of proficiency would require maybe 2 to 3 times as much work for a European language. So to get the same level we did in Spanish in 3 months, I would budget maybe a year in China. So it's not a small difference. It's not like it's 10% harder. It's maybe multiples harder. So that does make a difference. And most of that difficulty is not because of characters. It's not because of the pronunciation system, although that can be hard. But it's simply that the vocabulary has very little shared vocabulary. And
Right.
so when you go into learning Spanish, there's so many words that you get almost for free because they're similar to English, or at least they're easy to remember. So like we were saying, what would be an example? Like creative in Spanish is creativo, I think.
Creativo.
And I believe in Chinese it's 创造意. So like that's a word that you wouldn't be able to guess until you got to already a fairly high level of Chinese. Whereas if you were just to learn it and you don't know what that word is, it would be hard. So I would say the difficulty in the language caught us off guard a bit. If I were doing it, I might have switched the order of the countries because we were getting more fatigued, and they was also when the difficulty was increasing. I don't think it impacted China. China, I was able to maintain it, and I was very interested, but it was hard to do China and Korea back to back. Korea, we were pretty exhausted by that
By
point. So I
then,
think
it's mentally,
impacted
it's like acrobatics doing what you did. I mean, really, to think about it, because did you give yourselves any breaks between the places that you visited?
We didn't intend to. We had to give us a break between Brazil and China because originally we were going to go to Taiwan, and then that, who actually has an Indian passport, was going to have some problems staying there for the full 3 months. You can get 30 days there, but you couldn't get 3 months. So we were just kind of in crisis. Where are we going to go? We're going to go to Singapore. And we eventually decided, no, the best place is going to be to go to China. But it meant we had to go back to Canada to get visas. And that was about
So logistically, that's right.
Yeah, but we weren't intending to like go back to Canada and speak English for a month before starting the next leg of the journey. And I would say, it's, although I would have liked us to have been more rigid in Korea and China, I think it would have improved our Korean and Chinese if we had been more like we were in Spain. So this is not saying that taking the kind of half-assed approach is a valid alternative to the no English rule, but simply that I think it was, for us, it was actually not that we burnt out in Korea that was surprising, but that we didn't burn out in Spain and Brazil, I thought was surprising, that we were able to get to the 4th country before it started to feel kind of exhausting.
Like it was unraveling. I get that. Well, what
Yeah.
you did, again, is just back to back, especially think about that. It can be exhausting. And the mixture of words, right? Because I've been doing back to back as well. So I did Greece, Turkey, and Russian. And I would find Greek words slipping into Turkey, Turkish words slipping into Russian, Russian back to Greek. And
Absolutely.
it's really easy for the mind to mix these things up because we're learning them in a kind of a time frame that's similar, and so it's putting in the same place. Maybe sometimes it's hard to separate.
Absolutely.
You want to comment on that? Did you have any experiences where Spanish was slipping into other languages? Maybe
Spanish and Portuguese they're such similar languages that obviously it was difficult to keep them separate, and that we had a lot of influence.
there's a name for that language. It's called Portuñol.
Portuñol, yeah. But we had a lot of influence there. So, but also because again, our Spanish was so much stronger than our Portuguese. We also had I would say, a more amenable social situation to learning Spanish in Spain than we did in Brazil. We were in kind of a small town in Brazil where it was a lot of like, even if they're Brazilian, a lot of like people who were only there tourist for like a week or two. So we weren't building the long-term friendships that I think were very helpful for learning the language on the. If you're just having kind of passerby conversation, I don't find it as useful as you have, this friend that you've been hanging out with, every couple days for a few hours. That's when I think you get the real linguistic growth. So our Portuguese was a little worse than our Spanish, not to mention that when we were in Brazil, there were also a lot of people from Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay. So we were speaking to them in Spanish. So actually our Spanish got a bit better in Brazil as well.
I got it. So let me ask you about acceptance a bit, because to try and get acceptance from people who may want to practice their English, how do you do that? Do you lie to them and tell them you don't know English? Do you tell them what your project is? How do you explain that in the local language without all that vocabulary?
It's very funny. So I'm going to make a little side comment. It's not directly to your point, but when we were on the trip, the idea of only speaking in that language was both very obvious and also quite smooth. Like, it didn't actually create that much friction. Like, we were anticipating, what are we going to do about this and this? There were a couple situations where people were, let's speak in English, but it wasn't very common. However, the interesting fact is that after I've come back to Canada, and this could also be partially because I'm no longer in that immersive environment, I definitely feel much more pressure if I'm going to start speaking to someone in another language, just because the assumption is that I'm going to speak in English. So I think a lot of that was just mentally priming the idea that we have to speak in this language and making a big deal out of it. And that mental priming meant that once the ball was rolling, we didn't even think about speaking in the other language. So when situations would come up, they didn't feel awkward. It was just, I remember there was a guy in Brazil who was, we were chatting with, and he was really wanting to practice his English on us. And he would speak in English to me, and I would just respond in Portuguese. And there was just like, it didn't feel like there was a conflict. It was just like, this is what we needed to do. So I would say that generally what we would do when we were starting off in the language, particularly when we weren't as good, is we would explain that we have a project. So that was one of the first phrases that we would learn, and it would be kind of how we back ourselves out of a corner. So if someone starts speaking in English and then we don't know how to reply, but they know that we speak English, and it's just kind of, what's going on here? It would be like, tengo un proyecto, or something like this, de no hablar en inglés. And I would say that in, Spanish, or, voy oiga xiang. And I would say this in like Chinese. And then once the person got the idea, even if they disagreed with it, my behavior became sensical, because sometimes people don't understand that you're trying to speak in the language, and it's just very confusing if there's a communication breakdown. So just explaining that I have a project to not speaking English would mean that even if the person was like, I don't know why you're doing that, they would at least understand. My behavior would now make sense to them, and it would either they would stop talking to me, or it would run smoothly.
Right, because you're going against the grain. I mean, if English is the aspirational language for so many people, and wow, they have this chance to practice with a real native English-speaking person, I found that for some people it's a hard pill to swallow to say, I have to speak to you in bad Spanish, or I have to speak to you in beginning, Korean, when I get this, otherwise I would have this chance to practice. And so I found that it's helpful to do a few things. And I don't advocate them all, but I've tried them all. Lie. So, for example, pretend like I don't know English. That will throw them off the scent. I mean, if it's a person who's really dogged about using English, I might answer them back in another language and say, do you want to speak to me in this language? And if they don't know it, then, which 99% of the time they won't, then there's no argument anymore about it.
Yeah.
Or blame somebody else. I found that if I blame somebody else, like I'll say, this is, my teacher told me, every Tuesday I have to practice whatever language, then, like you're saying, it gives people, you give a reason, and a reason, even though it's stupid sounding, it's still a reason, and people accept reasons. So it's interesting,
So
that
what
psychology.
what I would say is that only when we were in Seoul did I feel any like the pressure to speak English was at all common. My recommendation is also you can avoid a lot of these issues in my mind by first of all just being obstinate. Like if you're dealing with someone who wants to speak in English, just be obstinate, and then you're going to eventually find people who will speak to you in the language. But also I also recommend going to places where if you have some choice about where you're going to stay, don't pick the biggest, most cosmopolitan cities. So like if you're going to go to France, don't live in Paris.
Paris. Why don't you go to Paris to the International Youth Hostel?
Yeah, like
and try and speak French there.
if you're going to go to China, don't go to Beijing or Shanghai. If you're going to go to, well, Spain is pretty good everywhere, I think. But maybe don't go to Barcelona if you're going to go to Spain.
Right.
If you're like when we were in Brazil, we were in Florianopolis. We weren't in Rio. You know, if you're going to go, so sometimes you don't have a choice about that, or sometimes you're already in this situation, and then you just got to make the best of it, and that's fine. You know, even in the city you're in, there's also some choices that you're going to make with, for example, when we were staying in Seoul, we stayed in an area called Seocho, which is near Gangnam, so, you know, Gangnam style. And it's near downtown, and it was mostly Korean, whereas the kind of standard place for foreigners to live is Itaewon. And Itaewon is like, if you go to Itaewon, it's going to be really hard to do it. Whereas where we were, even if the young people tended to speak English and would like to practice, you know, the shopkeepers, and they don't speak English. So you can still, like, I had a lot of like, you know, half understandable Korean conversations with Ajuma who worked at, who, you know, would make the kimbap every morning. So you can do that as well, I think.
So just in the interest of time, I wanted to get to some technical kinds of questions about what some certain strategies you had. So how did you deal with lack of comprehension? Did you listen for keywords? Did you have strategies that would help you to understand the context of what you were hearing rather than each individual word? Because it's real easy to get hung up on the blah, 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 blah. You know, they just said something to me. I have no idea what it was. And I'm not going to say I don't speak your language. Can you switch to English? So then what?
So what I would say, and these are not just specifically about comprehension, but also about speaking as well. I think there's a few tools that are useful to have with you. So one is always have a dictionary with you that has the language. If you don't have good data in the place that you're in, make sure it's an offline dictionary. Google Translate gets a lot of flack because it sometimes gives incorrect translations. But the nice thing about Google Translate, especially if you're at a novice level, is that Google Translate is intelligent enough that if you write a sentence, it can distinguish between homophones, or it can distinguish between words that have multiple meanings in perhaps your language or in the target language. So I would say, even though if you do Google Translate with Chinese, it will be wrong some of the time, and that's a point of criticism, we often found just using the straight dictionary was a lot harder, because I would type in a word and there would be 18 suggested translations, and you know from experience that most of those will not work, that actually doesn't do what you want it to do. And so if you do it in Google Translate, it gives you, okay, maybe now this has a 50% chance of being right, or a 60% chance.
Because of the context, exactly.
So, because you can just type in, I want to do this, instead of, you know, a more just the individual word. So I recommend having those apps on you all the time. What I would do when I was, for comprehension, if I don't understand what the person is saying, you know, obviously I'd ask them to repeat it. If we're just making chit chat, sometimes I don't understand that, we'll just skip over that. You know, that definitely has happened when you're having a long conversation with someone. If it is something important, like I can't miss it, get them to repeat it, or like, I don't understand what that word means, and then they would say it again. Depends on your level of ability, how fluently you can kind of work around words and definitions you don't understand. But if it was really coming down to it, I didn't know what they were saying, I could also just, here's my phone, write what you're saying, and I'll oh, it's this. Okay, that's what you're saying. You know,
I see. Okay, so you did use tools like that to get you out of a jam.
Oh, dictionaries were essential. And my feeling is that some people think, oh, well, you should be a purist and that you should never resort to your native language to even do translation. And I don't actually agree with that approach. My approach is that once I'm in the situation where I'm talking with you, then, and I want to use a word, then me looking up the dictionary, that's how I learn that word, right? That's me.
Yeah.
Like
It's
if
being
I were
called
to
to your
learn it.
attention
So,
at the moment. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
right. So I know some people are really against using dictionaries for things. My feeling is that some people worry that if you use the dictionary, you're just going to use it as a crutch. But my feeling is that using a dictionary is annoying enough that once you get good enough, you stop using it, even if you would like to learn some new vocabulary, just because pulling out your phone and looking up a word is very annoying.
Yeah, it
So you
can
sort
be.
of only, it is kind of an emergency only thing just because, like if I were every, what's a word for this and I'm talking with you, it would really stall the conversation.
It does, it does. On that point, how did you remember words? Did you have a certain thing that you did, a ritual around remembering? Because sometimes, especially like you said, once you depart further and further away from familiar languages, certain words are going to be really hard to understand and even harder to remember to pronounce correctly and remember how to say and all the syllables. And
Right.
what tricks did you have for that?
So this is an interesting point because I'm well aware that a lot of people advise for different mnemonics. So you can use mnemonic systems such as the keyword method. If anyone doesn't know this, you can look up the keyword method. It's very common in language learning circles for memorizing vocabulary. There's also spaced repetition systems as a way of, okay, I'm going to put it into this, my Anki deck or memorize, and that's how I'm going to memorize it. Now, I'm going to say this opinion of mine is not the consensus or the mainstream opinion, so take it with a grain of salt.
It's not
if you
orthodox.
disagree.
Okay, got it.
However, in my opinion, with all the language you're learning, the best way to memorize the words was to use them. And that sounds like, oh, that's obvious, but what else are you doing? But actually, no, it was fine. And the reason why is because in any language, there's going to be what I'll call core vocabulary, which you are using like every freaking day. You're using that word and you're using it all the time. And so you don't need to put any effort into learning the word. You just use it in situations. And
did you use
check
it
the
from a
dictionary.
written script, or did you just from day one you were trying to recall the word? Like,
Well,
for example, in
usually-
Spanish,
yeah.
a daily word that you might say is you want something, right? So, quiero un café,
Yeah.
quiero un té, quiero un vino, quiero.
Well, a big advantage, I think, as well, is that I was traveling with this partner of mine, and we did a lot of that practice between each other. So it wasn't just me with other Spanish
So
speakers.
you were drilling with him.
But it was that, like, I'm speaking to him, he's at the apartment, and I'm like, he wants to tell me that, like, oh, I'm going to take a shower, so, we'll leave in 15 minutes. So it's like, voy a ducharme. And it would be like, that's a word, phrase, pattern that gets repeated so frequently
Every
that
day.
at the beginning, I might be like, oh, shower, what's that? And it's like, oh, duchar, and I would say duchar. And then second time, maybe I look in the dictionary. Third time, but after a certain point, you just learn it. And I would say that was also true even for Chinese and Korean, that the words that we just used in daily speech a lot tended to happen. So where I tended to use Anki or spaced repetition systems, and I really only used them in China and Korea. I didn't use them in Spain and Brazil. I didn't consider them necessary for learning the vocabulary. But in those countries, it wasn't actually, this is non-standard usage, but it wasn't that I'm using this word and now I'm going to put it in my SRS system to use again and again. Instead, what it was that I was using the SRS system as kind of a way of doing like additional study so that I was able to get vocabulary that I've never used in a situation before. So I know that some people disagree with that, and I think there are definite weaknesses to that approach. And I think that my strategy will only work if you are not only in the no English rule, but you are in general social situations for a large percentage of your day. But I think if you do
in general
do that,
social situations, for a
meaning
large
that you're
percentage
having
of the-
conversations with people for a lot of the day, like you can say, I'm going to do no English and then stay at home and be a complete introvert and not interact with anyone except
Right.
for like, and in that case, it's not going to work. But if you're like the way I had, where I have someone else and we're both using kind of a very simplified version of the language, it just, the basic expressions were so overlearned that by about week 2 or 3 in the country, they required no thought. They would just immediately come out correctly, including Chinese and Korean, just because you only know 15 words, but you've used them to death, right? So that was a big part of it. So personally, I recommend, if I were to learn a new language from scratch, what I would recommend to a person is to start with the immersion, start with that component, and then do things like, do everything else on top of that, but get that foundation done correctly. Whereas if you start off with, well, I don't want to do immersion, that's scary, I'm going to do Duolingo instead, and like, what do you think of Duolingo? What do you think of Pimsleur or Rosetta Stone? I'm kind of like, well, they're not bad, but they're not the thing you should be doing. The thing you should be doing is this immersive practice, whatever it is. And then once you have that down, like, everything else is kind of window dressing. If you want to learn more vocabulary, practice that. When we were in Spain, I thought that I wanted to get the grammar better, so I did some textbook grammar practice. But again, this is supplement. This isn't the main way you're learning things.
So tell me, let's do a little teeny evaluation if you don't mind. So let's put those other methods versus immersion, and what is it you get from immersion that you don't get from those methods?
So I think there's a couple things. First is that it's very difficult to know in advance which words and which phrases you're going to need to use. I know some people talk about frequency lists and that kind of thing, but I'll give a good example. So one word, because we were doing these documentaries the whole time we were in the countries, one word that we learned I'm blanking on Korean, but I know it for the other languages, was record. Mm-hmm. Record something, which is not actually a very common word, but because we're constantly recording video for this project or recording our audio, it would be like, debemos grabar una grabación or something like that. It was grabar, I would be saying that all the time. Or things that are related to places or people or this kind of thing. So first of all, if you do an immersive approach, you are going to automatically be learning not only what words you need to learn, but you're going to be learning them at the correct frequency. So you're going to practice a word in Spanish, quiero, much, much, much more than, what would be, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a more obscure Spanish word, but like...
Deseo. I don't know.
Deseo,
desire,
right?
For example.
Or you're going to be practicing those core words and core phrases much more. So that's one advantage. Second advantage is, I think, the immersion approach really benefits from the psychological principle of overlearning, which is the idea that once you learn something beyond the point where you're getting any better at it, meaning that I'm saying a phrase and I know it and I say it immediately and I keep practicing it beyond that point, much beyond that point. Mm-hmm. It also makes it really drilled into your brain so that you will never forget it. So one of the real advantages I felt is that even when, let's say, my or that ability with the language was not as good as I'd like it to be. So Korean was a good example of where we were able to do day-to-day things, but conversations were really hard without having a dictionary for every second word. And but like, if we were to do, ask people where things were, or we were at a restaurant ordering stuff, or we were just having simple conversations about simple topics, we don't even have to think about it. And that's with completely different vocabulary, completely different grammar. It just feels very natural. And that's because those simple patterns were learned well beyond what was necessary to learn them, but to the point where it's now impossible for us to forget, how to say where things are, what something is, or that kind of thing.
Let's take Korean as an example. So in what month, so you were there 3 months, right? So in what part of that 3-month period did you feel like the majority of that started to solidify, where the reinforcement was happening, where you were pretty much you were able to deal with the things that were relevant to you, and you were starting to feel that reinforcement process happening? So
the way I would put it is that it's not really so much that there's a certain point where, now it's reinforced, but rather that if you imagine a language as a pyramid with the base vocabulary being the most frequent, most used, and then you get higher and higher pinnacles, what you can imagine that like it's like making a building out of concrete, and that the bottom layers, they're getting solid first as you learn the other ones. So maybe your bottom 2 layers are fully hardened concrete, and then the top layer, it's you have it, but it's kind of wet concrete, or it's not fully stable yet, and you can't build on top of it at the moment. So what I would say is that there's some very basic Korean phrases like hello, which is like 안녕하세요, and there's a very common sort of phrase which not only indicates sort of that it's kind of like is in English, but it can also mean like to have something. So you could say, like, if you were at a restaurant, do you have this would be the thing that they have, and then 있어요 would be the thing at the end. So those things got drilled in probably about like the second week. They were already like done to death, and we really knew them. And then you start, as you get further, it starts to be, you get more and more rarefied words and spectrum and stuff. So there would be, increasingly, things like, big and small, and places and food names, and, what is the word for hospital, and like these kind of words keep getting built on. And what I would say is that Korean, we do have that base strong, but it just doesn't go up as high. Like once you get to, there's a lot of words, I just don't know how to say that in Korean, whereas I would not even think about what it is in Spanish. I would automatically know it. So my feeling is that the immersion approach is nice because a lot of other approaches just try to build the building all at once, or they build like the fifth floor before the first floor, or they don't properly get the ground floor solidified before they try to build on top of it. So you're trying to learn stuff that I've met a lot of people that study kind of, they're learning the subjunctive in Romance languages, but they can't have like a fluent 20-minute conversation. That's absurd.
20 minutes? How about 5 minutes? I know people who have studied Arabic, for example, for 4 years, and they couldn't comfortably order and make chit-chat in an Egyptian restaurant.
Yeah. So my
or speak to a taxi driver about what they needed, rather than just showing the address. Yeah.
But like Spanish is, I think, a good example of that, because subjunctive is one of the most window dressings of all the grammatical things. Like, it is necessary for sounding correct, and for actually, there are some ideas where not using the subjunctive will confuse people as to what you're actually trying to say.
Right.
However, those aren't the majority of situations, and whereas something like the past tense, that quickly becomes useful once you start having to actually talk about things that have happened rather than just making requests. Now the past tense becomes useful. But my feeling is that if you do this immersive approach first, that you make that the foundation, and then you do whatever grammar, vocabulary study that you feel like you want to do on top of that, then you're not going to get into these situations where you're learning a lot of obscure things that aren't really related to actual functional ability. And I think that even someone like yourself, or someone who's learned a lot of languages and really knows what they're supposed to be learning, I feel that tendency to learn the wrong things, or to learn them to an insufficient ratio, that you're learning the more common things not nearly as much compared to the less common things, those sort of mismatches in practice are so prevalent that it's almost impossible to avoid, I would say. So unless you're doing some kind of immersion, you can be guaranteed that you're doing that wrong, that it's not possible to do it right unless you're doing immersion, and you just got to hope that having a really inefficient approach will eventually get you the right combination, have some speaking ability.
I think that point is really, really well taken. And the way I'm thinking about it is, it's pretty much like I'm having a problem where I need a specific solution, because it's me, it's my life, it's my communication, it's the vocabulary I prefer to use, that I want to know how to say in the target language. And so that's a specific solution that I need, but yet what I'm being offered are general solutions. So I'm being offered a general, here's the entire book with all the grammar, chapter by chapter, digest it all, and then at the end figure out how to apply it specifically, versus I need to figure out what I need to talk about specifically, and I'm going to learn the language in the function of that. And then it'll stick more, because obviously if I need it, I'm going to have to use it, and if I have to use it, I'm going to reinforce it, right?
So my feeling is that as a general rule, what you want to do is, if you do this immersive approach and you kind of learn things, again, the no English rule works so well because every situation in your life now, if you don't know how to say it, you have to look it up. And so whereas the approach some people take is, well, I'm going to speak English when I don't know how to do things, and then I'm going to practice for certain. It doesn't work that way, because the opportunity to learn is when you realize you are missing the thing in Spanish or French or Chinese. And that's the opportunity to learn how to say this or what you're supposed to do. And so if you kind of throw away that learning opportunity by saying, oh, well, I'm going to speak in English for right now because I don't know how to do this, it's kind of backwards. So that's my feeling about this approach. I would highly recommend it to anyone who's...
Last questions about that approach. Thank you so much. Last question about that approach. What... think of any points, like low points of frustration. Obviously there are so many, right, when we're learning a language and we can't express ourselves the way we want, and we may be missing out on something because of the fact that we're limited in our ability to communicate. At the lowest points, what kept you going? Was it internally motivated or externally motivated?
Well,
or
there
both?
was a for what I was doing, I think part of it, and someone could emulate this to a certain extent by making a public commitment. But when Vat and I were doing this project, there was a very strong sense of we don't have a choice about this anymore. Like if we fail, it has to be because we exhausted the possibilities. We can't. I made an announcement about this. We're doing this project. We're making all these recordings. I can't just say after 2 months, oh, that was hard. I can't do that. Like that wasn't an option anymore. It was like, well, if it physically can't work anymore, then it can't work, but I don't have an option about it. So that was a huge thing for me. And I think the thing I want to stress, because I think a lot of people who have never done this before are thinking, yeah, there's going to be a lot of low points. It's going to be really hard. It's going to be a real grind. And I don't want to say that it's it's peachy and it's easy. But what I do want to say is that I'm just saying from the difference between before we did this and after, like having gone through that experience, that the difficulty with immersion is surprisingly short. Mm-hmm. That the point where it feels like, oh my God, this is the hardest thing I've ever done, it doesn't last very long, and it stops feeling that way before you actually get good in the language. Mm-hmm. So for Spain, I would say the period where we were like, oh my God, this is actually like a real grind and it's difficult, for Spanish was about maybe 2 weeks. For Chinese, maybe a month and a half. But in any case, when we reached that point, we were not good at those languages. We were still quite bad, but it had become comfortable. It had become like something that was, this is just part of our life. And I think that that's something that's often missed by people who are getting started in this, is that they imagine, oh my God, I'm going to do a commitment to not speaking English. That's going to be the hardest, most difficult thing I've ever done in my life. And it is an easy thing to do. I'm not saying that it's trivial, but I feel like if you were to take the total amount of effort you put into learning a language, not just in the beginning, but just you were to add up how much sort of, if you could quantify pain and struggle and sweat and that kind of thing and put it into a number, and you were to total up how much time till you get to fluency using the immersion approach or the traditional studying approach, I would say the immersion approach is easier by an order of magnitude, because it is very difficult in that start. But when we were in Spain, after about a month, we had friends, we were doing stuff. It was just part of our life. We weren't thinking about, oh yeah, we're consciously trying to learn Spanish. It would just be, oh yeah, I just have to check words every once in a while. It's just a habit now, So it's something I would definitely recommend to people to try out.
Super interesting experience. Really interesting to hear what that felt like, what that was like on the ground. Thank you. Is this experience influenced? I know you're on to another set of projects and things. How has that segued into this? Does it have any relationship to?
Well, my blog is always
education now.
Yeah, my blog has always been about learning. So I did the MIT challenge, which we didn't talk about, but people who can go to my blog can find out about that. And then I did this A Year Without English. And then recently I've been focused more on how do people develop career skills through learning. So this has just been, I think, one piece in the learning puzzle that I've been putting together. But I do feel like being able to learn foreign languages, being able to speak multiple languages is something that, although not everyone desires it, it's something that a lot of people would like to do. I've spoken to a lot of people that, oh, I wish I could speak Spanish, or oh, I wish I could speak French, or even that they're just impressed that someone can speak Arabic or Chinese. And I think from going through this experience and seeing how with the right approach, with the right mentality, with applying the effort at the right key focal points, it's actually a lot easier than people think it is, at least to get to a level where it's okay, you know. It takes a lifetime to become the way you are in English, and you have there it's 100% the same. But just to get to a level where, you know, right now I recently went to Argentina, and I was there for a couple weeks, and it was just, you know, it was back into speaking Spanish. It was fine. And so I think that for a lot of people, given how much they might enjoy learning another language and how much that's a goal that they have in their life, I think if you take the right approach, the cost benefit, I think the cost of learning a language is considerably lower if you use the right approach than most people realize.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think it's true. It's about smart learning. It's about really knowing where to put the focus. Yeah, excellent.
I just wanted to add a final point before we go, that anyone who's interested, because I've spoken about learning these languages, but I think the most convincing is a demonstration, which VAT did these incredible documentaries, these little things showing our week-by-week progress in the different countries. So we have that for Spain, Brazil, China, and we have an interesting kind of variant on that for Korea. So I think if you are interested in what we've talked about and you want to see, okay, what is something that might be possible in a couple months of learning, I highly recommend taking a look at it and seeing what is actually like to learn the languages.
And where can that be found again?
So my recommendation, I'll send you the link after if you want to include it with this post, but if you just search for The Year Without English, it should come up, the videos on YouTube. Or you can go to my blog, scotthyoung.com/blog, and it's you just click on projects, and it's one of the projects, and I have all the videos and all the recordings and everything we've done lumped together there.
Wow, Scott Young, an advocate for experiential learning. Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much. No, thank you so much for opening some horizons for people. I'm sure people who listen to this will be inspired to take it into their own hands, right? I mean, it's just about communication.
That's great.
But what a brave thing to do. 4 languages
if anyone here does it, if anyone here decides to do their own no English rule for learning a language, please send me an email. I always like hearing from people who have taken up the mantle.
Excellent. And send it to them in the language you're learning as well.
All right, great.
Thank you. Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed it. For more perspectives useful to immersion learners, from sociolinguists to experiential trainers to world travelers and others, please stay tuned for more.